Then you're left with either it was a really fun experience or it was a really good show. Oftentimes those two things are not part and parcel. Like there are shows in which I laughed harder every day from the moment I got there to the moment I left, and I loved being there, and nobody watched the show. Or I would see it on TV and I'm like, what were we laughing about? And then there are shows on my CV that are like incredibly well respected, especially a lot of the kind of the single camera ones that were well loved by the critics, and I couldn't wait to leave at the end of the day. They were just really challenging work experiences, or a very pedantic writer's room and a fun one. So I'm not going to pick a favorite, because my favorite really kind of differs based on like whatever the criteria, and I've yet to find the perfect show.
Bryan and I continue our discussion. We discuss many of the shows he's worked on and some experiences in the writing room, and of course the Mary question. Enjoy the second half of our discussion. Tell me a little bit about, when did you know you wanted to be a writer, and did music and the storytelling of music feed that desire for you to be a storyteller?
That is a wonderful question. I have a two-part answer, which is not to say that I know what my answer is going to be, but I assume it'll be in two parts.
Okay.
I think I became a writer initially, almost defensively.
Okay.
And, because I always say to people, nobody becomes a comedy writer because they were too popular in their middle school lunchroom, yes, or their relationship with their mother was too good. So like, I think I discovered comedy as kind of a coping mechanism. I never knew I was funny. I was incredibly shy, but as I started to write these speeches for speech and debate in high school. People were like, "Wow, you're really funny." And then I started to write a column at Brown, and I was getting really good response. And it was like, people were like, "Wow, you're funny." I was like, "I am." It's like, it never occurred to me. I certainly didn't get that. I didn't get that in high school, and I didn't get that at home. But it was the first time I ever kind of discovered a voice. And I didn't know, I didn't have words for it then, but obviously that's what I was doing. It was the first time I was like kind of learning who I was through my writing. So that's how I became a comedy writer.
Okay.
But I would say in the past 10 years, I've started to explore a lot of different kinds of writing, independent of and in addition to my TV writing, which is included like writing a lot about my family dynamic and my father's passing and the family aftermath to that passing. And I I started writing a lot of pieces, first for the Huffington Post, then for Medium and for Substack. But I have about 40 of them that are up on HuffingtonPost.com under my name. And one of them it's interesting. One of them I wrote contemporaneous to the time that I was reading Bruce's autobiography.
Okay.
And the premise to this column was, and in addition to reading the Bruce book, I was reading American Pastoral by Philip Roth, another famous native son of New Jersey, different part of New Jersey, but equally evocative to Bruce in terms of capturing a sense of time and a sense of place. And what I wrote about in this column was how jealous I was of the two of them. And I was like, I acknowledge I was probably the only person who born and lived in Los Angeles who's jealous that he didn't grow up in New Jersey. But what I loved about them is there was something so clearly well delineated about where they grew up and what that experience was, and their ability to write about their sense of place was palpable. But then as I continued on in the column, I started to realize that like growing up in the suburbs of Los Angeles, specifically in the San Fernando Valley, specifically in like Encino, which is a famous Jewish suburb of LA, that like my experiences were equally specific and equally valid, as kind of a thing to write about in a place of discovery. And consequently, I've written a lot more about, whether it's in columns or pilots, and I wrote a novel. All of them are very specific to where I grew up. And a lot of that I thought was sort of kind of retroactively inspired by Bruce and by Philip Roth and like other songwriters and novelists and any kind of storyteller whose, you know, voice is heavily influenced by where they grew up, where they live, and when they grew up. And I've started to sort of embrace what made my upbringing unique. You know,
Yeah.
it may not be the source of a pop song, but, you know, like you pointed out earlier, the Beach Boys were able to take growing up in Hawthorne, a suburb of Los Angeles, and give themselves a unique voice and a unique sound. So there's no reason that anyone can't, with the proper introspection, dig deep and say, like, you know, wow, where I grew up and when is worthy of a story to tell. And I
Yeah.
thought that was, you know, that's probably the closest, when you said like, were you influenced by songwriters and by Bruce specifically? I don't know. I don't think I was initially. At first, I just wanted to write jokes, and I wanted people to like me, and I wanted people to laugh and say I was funny. But, you know, with maturity and with kind of a greater range of storytelling, I was able to kind of find that connection, with not just Bruce, but like, you know, whether it's Tom Petty and, you know, and his roots in Gainesville, Florida, or John Mellencamp in Bloomington, Indiana, or Bob Seger in Detroit, you know, or even, you know, Eminem. You know, there's no shortage of songwriters whose sense of place is really foundational to their success and foundational to their ability to craft stories that are unique to their experiences.
I think, right. I'm trying to think. I know that Mike Myers once in an interview said, I became a comedian because I want everyone to love me. Have you never met a comedian before? And I know one of my favorite stories is from Mark Evanier, who also has written for TV and done a lot of comic book writing. And he's one of my favorite bloggers. And, you know, he grew up in the California area too. And he talked about that when he met Dick Van Dyke, he was trying to tell him that, you know, I became a TV writer. And he said Dick Van Dyke stopped him and said, you thought that you would get to hang out with fun people like I did in the Dick Van Dyke Show, and you could marry Tyler Moore. And
Absolutely.
Mark Everett goes, yes. And he says, you'd be surprised how many people have told me that story.
Well, I mean, that is a common story, and it's a common story about what you thought it was going to be like.
Yes.
But the reality of it is, a disproportionately high number of comedy writers get into it like less by choice and more by necessity.
Right.
That it's kind of how you learned to cope with the world, and a world that at times could feel lonely and hostile.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are trying to sort of fill a hole in their soul, with the laughter of others. So and I'm sure musicians, many of them would probably say the same things. Like, they didn't turn to become storytellers or musicians because they saw the career path. I think they turned to it as a way of making sense of the world and healing their pain. And then they looked up and were like, wow, I can also make money at it. Or, wow, people are responding to it. I'm going to keep doing it. But I do think that there's a lot of similarities in the type of people who become comics and stand-up comics and comedy writers, and those who become musicians. Probably more so than like drama writers or movie writers or comic book writers. And I'm sure there are people across all the disciplines who would say it's true. but I think there's something very specific about comedy and music that draw from people with very similar disposition.
Yeah. Do is trying to pick children, right? You can't, but is there a specific you've worked on a lot of great shows. I mean, I'm looking at this Last Man Standing and Big Shots, Jake Effect, New Adventures of O Christine, Eight Simple Rules. This Says Nothing If I'm With Her, which by the way, I wish could have gone longer because
Me
I love
too.
that premise. Well, they were both just very fascinating leads. And you in the like in one of the first few episodes, they used the John Hyatt song. For That Was the Date, right? That
Oh
he
yes,
yeah,
that's right. Have a little faith in me. Good
yeah.
memory.
Yeah, well, John Hyatt is one of my other favorite musicians.
And well, you have good taste. That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
And so is there one that you go, man, I would have loved to have done this one just because of the people involved? And is that hard to say?
You meaning specifically of the ones that I've been on?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you want to share your wish list of,
Yeah, no,
of
no, no.
room you would have liked to work on.
No, I mean it's a difficult question, and I'll tell you why it's difficult. Because every show, and I created none of them. So I
Yeah.
should tell you that I have like none were my own creation, and none do I have any sort of financial interest in their success.
Yeah.
So let's eliminate those two reasons.
Right.
Then you're left with either it was a really fun experience or it was a really good show.
Yeah.
And oftentimes those two things are not part and parcel. Like
Yes.
there are shows in which I laughed harder every day from the moment I got there to the moment I left, and I loved being there, and nobody watched the show. Or I would see it on TV and I'm like, what were we laughing about? And then there are shows on my CV that are like incredibly well respected, especially a lot of the kind of the single camera ones that were well loved by the critics, and I couldn't wait to leave at the end of the day. They were just really, really challenging work experiences, or a very pedantic writer's room more than a fun one. So I'm not going to pick a favorite, because my favorite really kind of differs based on like whatever the criteria is.
Sure.
And and I've yet to find the perfect show.
So what would frustrate me, and I probably am preaching to the choir, but when you and I exchanged some email, Twitter messages, and you said, sure, Jesse, I'd love to be on the show. So, I go to IMDb and, I'm going, Jennifer Falls, what? Holy shit. I love this actress. How did I miss this show? Right? Like,
no. I mean, we're in a time of unlimited content, and yet no jobs. But that's for another day. But let's stick with the unlimited content part. Like, it's you can be the world's biggest Jamie Presley fan and still not know that she had a 8-episode show on TV Land in 2014, because we're busy living our lives.
Yes. It's not streaming anywhere. I was telling my wife about it because she loved her on Mom.
No, I loved her on Earl.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So there are still plenty of places you can stream if you love Jamie Presley. You may not be able to find Jennifer Falls just yet.
But Save Me looks like it was hilarious. And once again, never heard of that.
I mean, you had Anne Heche thinking that she could talk to God. I mean, what's not to like?
Yeah.
But again, like, that was a really difficult production in which we did 6 episodes, and they fired the showrunner. They fired the boss, threw out the 6 episodes, and we started again with another 6 with another boss.
Wow.
So like one of the beauties, and I'm using the word beauty very loosely, but one of the benefits of having done this as long as I have is you learn not to judge you learn not to extrapolate from any one experience.
Yes.
Like I had a pretty tough time on my first job, which was Ned and Stacy on Fox back in 96, 97.
Yeah.
It was one of my favorite shows. It was my favorite show as a fan the year before, when I was just living in San Francisco and watching it, thinking like, wow, someday I'd love to be on a TV show. And the next year I was, but it was really hard to be in that room. But when that was my only experience, it was hard not to assume that, like, wow, if I'm having difficulty here, who's to say that they won't all be like this? And what
Yeah.
I've discovered is there is no shortage of different experiences if you're fortunate enough to, to have this career for as long as I've been.
So Bryan,
Um,
do you
yes,
do
sir.
you do you think it's the showrunner that helps make the tone?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the short answer and the long answer.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So
No, but I will say that tone can represent any number of things, from, oh, the showrunner is mean, the showrunner doesn't want to go home because he hates his wife,
yeah,
so he makes you work till 4 a.m. Or the showrunner can be someone who doesn't have a very strong sense of what the series is about.
mhm,
Whereas, for instance, the woman I worked with who ran The New Adventures of Old Christine was brilliant at knowing exactly the tone of the show, exactly how she wanted the show to be run. But then she fired me after the first season. So, like, you can have a showrunner who is great at their job, but then may not connect with you.
yeah.
So there's no shortage of landmines and pitfalls and
Yeah.
and reasons that an experience can get tricky.
Similar to professional managers and coaches, and often in entertainment jobs, very few jobs are, this will not be your last job, right? Like, either the audience is going to tell you you're no longer needed, the showrunner is going to tell you you're needed, the network may say longer no needed, right? I mean, it is the nature of the business.
Absolutely, and that again is a function of doing it long enough to
Yeah.
gaining that perspective.
All right, so I have one more pet peeve, and then we'll get back to music. And
Sure.
I remember, and I can't remember the year. You probably do, but I remember when the TV writers had a strike, and one of the things they were talking about is that the way you were compensated, you got paid X money for the first broadcast and then Y money for a rerun, but reruns were going away and no one was being paid for streaming, and they didn't want to pay for streaming because they weren't making any money. And now then I get angry every time I go to stream something and it says fast forwarding is disabled, and I have to sit through ads. And I go, I bet you they're not paying the writers one freaking penny for these. Just want to share. I didn't want to give, you don't have to answer. I just wanted to vent to someone who might know.
Yeah, it's probably better that I
Yes,
not
we'll move
go
on.
a soapbox, but I mean, you are correct in the way you described the issues facing the writers then. I mean, and you could see how prescient they were in 2008. I mean, I don't think anyone could have imagined the extent to which all TV would have gone to the internet and gone to streaming. But yes, the old model is no longer being applied in terms of reruns, because there's no such thing as a rerun on a streaming service, because everything's a rerun essentially. And so there is a model that was worked out by the guild in the previous bargaining sessions, in which there is a payout for a show that streams.
Yeah.
But it's nothing that compares to either the reruns that you were describing on first run broadcast,
Yeah.
or when a show is syndicated. So many of the financial incentives that sort of lured a lot of people to become TV writers have gone away with the proliferation of streaming.
Yeah.
But that's for another day.
That is for another podcast. All right. So you mentioned Letter to You. So thoughts on Western Stars and Letter to You?
Western Stars, I don't know as well.
Okay.
Although I think I did watch the accompanying movies from both.
Yeah.
I love Hello Sunshine. I love the premise of the album, which is that he wanted it to sound akin to kind of a early 70s like AM radio,
Yeah.
Laurel Canyon kind of vibe. Which I live 2 blocks from Laurel Canyon. So that was riding around in my parents' Dodge Dart in the 70s, listening to those kind of canyon sounds is right up my alley. So
Yeah.
I think I will give it definitely. I should give it another visit.
Well, and it felt like Elmore Leonard short stories, right? Like I was a big Justified fan, and
cool.
and it felt like some of the short stories felt like this. Oh, it's a collection of Elmore Leonard short stories. So yes, yeah.
Now, Letter to You, and again, I think so much of the way that we respond to music and to Bruce specifically has to do with the context in which we hear it.
Yes.
Now, it came out during the pandemic. It came out at a time when I was deeply depressed and not working. And it just struck me as like it's so emotionally resonant. Everything from Ghosts to Letter to You to I'll See You in My Dreams, and then like there were those trio of old songs that we referred to at the beginning of the podcast that he had kind of repurposed. And then all of that coupled with with that beautiful black and white documentary that went with it. So there was something about, I have no idea which or any of those songs which will have staying power. It's hard not to imagine him opening with Ghosts a lot or encoring with it, because that just sounds like a crowd favorite. But I don't know that I realized how much I missed that E Street in the studio sound.
Yes.
That so much of it like reminded me of all the things that I love about Born in the USA and the River specifically.
Yeah.
And also, I don't want to give them short shrift, but The Rising and Magic are also two of my all-time faves. And I'm also a big fan of a lot of Working on a Dream.
Yeah.
Like in the way we were talking about Western Stars being about a certain time, I know that like a lot of Working on a Dream was meant to evoke a lot of like kind of a more poppier sound, and again, poppier in a good way. It's not like you're not going to play it next to Doja Cat or Dua Lipa, or Drake on the radio right now, or Harry Styles, but like pop in the sense that like Tomorrow Never. It wasn't. There was a song. Is it Tomorrow? It's not Tomorrow Never Knows, because that's a Beatles song.
Yeah.
There was a song like that. And there was Surprise, Surprise.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah.
And Kingdom of Days, I found again, that was not long after my dad died. And that was another one of those songs that I found, both like as a nice balm, toward, to a lot of my depression. So you never know what you're going to like, even on albums that wouldn't necessarily be anyone's favorite. It's like, hey, I still love the song Lucky Town. I love Better Days. I love Human Touch. You may or may not love an entire album, but I love Land of Hope and Dreams. There's
so like I was very clear. I mentioned this often on the podcast in 2020 that if we got when there started being rumors about a new Bruce album, and we're just in the middle of this pandemic, and it was such a horrible year. And I said, if we got a new president in the fall of 2020 and a new Springsteen album, perhaps this may not be the worst year in history.
No, we were doubly blessed.
Yes. And so it is hard for me to disconnect. For example, my first show was a Rising show. And so I really, like everyone, I have feelings about the Rising, with everything that happened in 9/11. And then the next time I went and saw Bruce was a Devils and Dust tour. So while some people may not have a lot of, it's okay, because it was the first album I knew I was going to see him. So I listened to Devils and Dust over and over and over again. So like, okay, if he plays something from this album, I'm ready. And so therefore I have a lot of happy memories about that release, because it was the first show I felt like I'd done my homework, that, I actually knew what I was going into understanding. So, yeah.
I totally get it. I mean, and specifically about Bruce, The Rising, and 9/11. Even like even before The Rising came out, I just, I remembered just that bewildering numbness that we all felt. And, one of the first things that gave me any hope or solace was that America Tribute to Heroes concert.
Yes.
That was, not even like a concert, but like almost a series of musical vignettes. And Bruce could have played any number of songs that we knew, but he played a brand new composition that hadn't been recorded yet, My City of Ruins.
Yeah.
And he played it acoustic, and it was just so deeply moving and resonant. And it's hard not to associate that song with that concert, but that song with our feelings post 9/11. And I think, that's kind of what I was, sort of getting at earlier. And in fact, I feel both of us were that as adults, so many of our Bruce memories are, have to do with the emotions we were feeling contemporaneous to that music coming out, and sort of the events that we were going through, either in our personal lives, with your illness, with my grief. I think, a lot of Bruce songs, even the ones that we knew from growing up or knew in our teens or our 20s, have taken on a greater resonance as the years have passed, both in our lives and in terms of his performance of them. I go back to, and I know we mentioned it a little earlier, but so many of those songs that he sang in the Bruce on Broadway piece just have so much more emotional weight being sung by an old man looking back than they even did being sung when they first came out, being sung by a young person with his whole life ahead of him. And I think that's probably, as in my case, as a almost 57-year-old man,
yeah,
I'm hearing those I'm hearing the songs again, with mortality in mind and maturity in mind.
Yes.
And I think that's what's given his music, more than a lot of people's music, so much more staying power. It is that emotional connection.
Yeah, I well said. All right. I'm going to end this with the Mary question, but before I get to that, any final thoughts you want to share, Bryan?
No, I don't know what your last question is, so I'm kind of nervous about that, because I didn't hear what you said.
Okay.
But no, I greatly appreciate you seeking me out. I was a little hesitant to come on for the last. I'm not sure when you first contacted me, but ironically, I had not been in a very Bruce phase when you first reached out to me, and I felt a little disingenuous coming on and talking about him. I had just, for whatever reason, during a lot of the depression of the pandemic, in addition to Letter to You, I had kind of like immersed myself in the history of country music. It's something I know very little about.
That Ken Burns documentary was brilliant.
Yeah, and that was my gateway. I watched the documentary like during the first week of the pandemic, and from there I just continued to dive deeper and deeper into Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings and Merle Haggard and George Jones and Tammy Wynette and Loretta Lynn and Dolly, and from there, it was just like, I mean, especially we're talking about me, a Jew from Encino, like country music does not come naturally.
Sure.
So I'm both more in a Bruce phase now, but also the things that connect me about the storytelling of people telling honest country stories. Country has just as much schlock as any other genre.
Yeah.
But the songs that are from the heart and that are and have and connect emotionally, I'm able to see kind of the through line between that and Bruce, and why someone who loves, Willie Nelson or Merle Haggard or Johnny Cash might also love Bruce, because they're all singing from the heart and writing from the heart.
Yeah.
And,
I love Johnny's version of Highway Patrolman, and it just, in fact, yeah. I may prefer that over Bruce's version. And
I don't blame you.
I would, I would love to sit down with Roseanne Cash, right? Because she's, just because watching that documentary and Marty Stewart and you're like, how much fun would it be to just sit down with a beverage of your choice and just listen to them tell stories? So I'm
Yeah,
right
I
there
mean,
with you.
and again, like I don't have the connection to it of like, oh, I grew up listening to Pappy's radio, because like this was all new. This was like I had just discovered an alternate universe. But like, if you didn't cry when Roseanne Cash sang "I Still Miss Someone" at Johnny Cash's memorial, at the Ryman, like you don't have a heart,
Well,
but
eh,
whether you knew it or not.
yeah. Well, and what meant a lot to me, because if you were interviewing me and you said, "What's your origin story?" I would tell you I grew up. My parents loved country music. My dad was from Tennessee, Ohio. My mom was from Louisiana. I was born in Louisiana. My dad was in the army, so we moved around a lot, but by far, most of our time was either in Kentucky or Louisiana. And country music was all we listened to. I mean, that's all I heard. So I grew up listening to Johnny Cash and Merle Haggard and Charlie Pride and Hank Williams. And so hearing all that, it brings me back. In fact, when Merle Haggard died, I felt like I lost my dad all over again.
Wow.
It just,
Wow.
because he loved that music so much, and Willie Nelson. And so, yeah, it's an amazing world out there. And I think you said it really well. Absolutely. There is some shiny fake cowboy hat bro country out there, but there's also people that are telling good stories, that
Yeah,
are beautiful stories.
and they're still, and to this day,
Yeah.
the things I hear from Chris Stapleton and Luke Combs and
Yeah.
Miranda Lambert and Maren
Yeah.
Morris, like those, that, anyone who tells a story from the heart about and speaks truth, and roots their songs in a time and place and specific experience, you can be, like I said, a Jewish fella from Encino, and still be deeply moved by Chris Stapleton's stories about his upbringing. And
Yeah.
I think that's the power of music. And I think obviously it would have been more emotional to me watching Ken Burns and doing that kind of extensive country music research if I had grown up on it.
Yeah.
But the truth is I didn't. And I was, that afforded me an opportunity as a 55-year-old man to hear it for the first time and react to it completely out of context, just as a piece of art. And it's been a really joyous exploration, and a very fruitful one as well.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. Hope you had fun.
Let me see. Yeah, so fun. I mean, and I even missed the NBA draft for this. That's how excited I was.
Well, I appreciate that. Luckily, the Mavericks traded their pick, so I didn't have to worry about that.
Okay.
So yeah, I was going to ask.
Go watch it. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I was going to ask you, were you the LA Raiders? Was that your football team? Because that seems the right time for you, right?
I did enjoy the Raiders. They did win the Super Bowl when I was in high school. But my real love was the Rams.
Okay, it was.
Yes, that's what I mean. The Rams, it's hard to even kind of explain to someone. The Rams were arguably bigger than the Dodgers or the Lakers in the city of LA when I grew up. It started to change when they moved to Orange County, and obviously it changed a lot when they went to St. Louis. But prior to that, I have a lot of really great memories of watching games with my dad and and his buddies, and a lot of it's sort of tied into that.
My son, we moved to Dallas in '86, and so he was born in '89. So he's lived in Dallas his whole life, and he bleeds Cowboys, right? Like it just that's it, And so and I will tell him tomorrow about your comment about loving Troy back, because of his college days. So,
oh my God, Troy was a godsend in 88, 87, 88 for the Bruins. To get him as a transfer from Oklahoma was a miracle. I'll leave you with this, because there was a long period where we had no team, and
Yeah.
and I had a son who loved football. We didn't know what to do, so it wasn't that I was trying to turn him into a Cowboys fan, but the closest we could get to pro football was driving up the coast to Oxnard to see
Sure.
Cowboys training camp. So we had a great day. We had a great day up there watching Tony Romo and eating tri-tip sandwiches. And
Oh man, I love that.
And I almost pulled it off until Father and Son by Cat Stevens came on the radio on the ride home, and I looked over at my boy and I started sobbing, and I was like, "Oh man, I was so close to being like a cool dad." But
I love that. Here's my question. I end every podcast with this question, so I'll give you the premise. Jay Armstrong is an honors English teacher from the Philadelphia area. He just recently retired. He's just written a book, Bedtime Stories for the Living, talking about he has a chronic illness and it's caused him where he had to quit teaching. But when he was teaching his seniors, they would spend 2 days in their honor English class breaking apart Thunder Road. They would look at the lyrics, they would look at the themes, they would talk about, what Bruce is trying to say and explore. And at the end of the 2 days, Jay would ask his class, does Mary get in the car? So Bryan, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
Wow, that's a tough question. I'm going to say yes. I don't really know the answer, nor do I have a strong opinion.
Okay.
But I am as much as Bruce chronicles people who sometimes feel trapped by circumstance and trapped, whether it's in a dead end town or their family of origin or the place they grew up in that may not be surrounded by people like them. I think his ultimate message is usually one of hope, and it's usually one that lands on the concept, that there are better days ahead, that if you get that, America is a place of unlimited potential and opportunity, and that there's always an open road ahead for you, and if you just get on the road in the dead end town, you're going to find your bliss and you're going to find your happiness. So I'm gonna end on a hopeful note and say that that yes, you got us in the car.
Wonderful, great answer. If someone wants to reach you, what's the best way?
Well, I'm kind of a social media nerd who has tried to embrace, even at my age, tried to embrace all forms of it. I'm probably best known, if I'm known for anything, for my Twitter account. Okay. Which is just my name, Bryan Behar, Bryan Behar. I'm up to 207,000 followers, which is not bad for an old geezer like myself. Who
very nice.
Even I realized a couple days ago that even Nils Lofgren follows me. So look out.
Very nice. Yes.
Yeah,
that's great.
I have no idea why, but but if you don't mind, I'm gonna throw up some publicity for this session.
Absolutely.
I'm going to say that we did it, and then once you have something to listen to, I'll also let my followers and friends
absolutely
know about it. So I've had a wonderful time, and it's been a pleasure. I mean, this is Bruce is a topic that no one's ever asked me about, and I felt I had a surprising a lot to discuss, and that's a tribute to the questions you asked, and just and the man himself, and just a lot of the feelings that he and his music have engendered over many, many decades. So this was a pleasure.
Well, Bryan, thank you. That's very sweet of you to say. I love, that's one of my favorite compliments is I've had, like sportscasters on and sports writers and novelists and they'll say, I usually have to talk about my book, or I'm usually talking about, the Yankees or the Red Sox or the Marlins or the Eagles. And to have a chance to talk to Bruce is just a joy. So I'm glad you had fun. I think this was a great interview. I just loved visiting with you, and I could visit with you anytime. So whenever your next gig is, reach out to me and we're going to have you on and we're going to promote your new gig to try to get some viewers on. Okay.
That's great. You're even though I only met you tonight for real, you're a
Yeah.
kind man, and it's very much appreciated. Thank you for giving me a forum to talk about stuff. All of which is all of which feels meaningful. We talked about a lot more than music. We talked about real life and feelings, and I'm totally up for that. And
Well, that sounds
very,
great.
very appreciative.
All right, listeners, go get vaccinated, go get boosted, and let's try to be kind to each other because really that's the only way we're going to get through. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, listeners, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
These are the wonderful patrons of this podcast. Their financial support helps the podcast to keep going. I want to send a major shout out and thank you to Steve Rogers, Chris Bloom, Randy Brown, Betsy Hodges, Anna Lynn, Stephen Malio, Andrew Goddard, Crystal Carroll, Dale Hosick, Bella Pori, Terry Smith, John Munson, Mary Thomas, and Rob Barnett. Thank you, team. You guys are the best. Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter at setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is at jessejacksondfw. You can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only, Set Listing Bruce. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.